Welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Monday, January 27th, 2025, and on Mondays we deal with mathematics and statistics. And for some reason, I don't understand, I seem to get the least amount of clicks on Mondays. Oh well. Uh, Again, we're going to talk a little bit about mathematics and statistics, but I hope from a relatively enjoyable or even entertaining fashion in some respects. And I want to talk about something that probably most of you are familiar with, uh, and where there's some pretty serious implications if you take the issue seriously. And that has to do with kind of gambling. And more specifically, what if you were to try to gamble or bet on the famous March Madness, the NCAA basketball tournaments, men's and women's? I want to share with you a fascinating set of statistics and set of procedures and calculations with respect to why it's so difficult to guess who's going to win the tournament, but more specifically, why nobody can establish a perfect bracket or get all the guesses absolutely right. It's virtually impossible. Now, statistically speaking, mathematicians have devised a variety of different ways that we can go about assessing the probability of picking all 63 games, not including the four play-in games at the beginning, but how can you pick them correctly for the men's or women's NCAA basketball tournament? And so the simplest method, of course, but obviously inaccurate, would be to treat each game as a coin flip. Okay? And remember that each independent coin flip, again, assuming a fair coin, has two possibilities, right? The proverbial heads or tails. And so if you're going to calculate the odds of 63 different coin flips, there's a multiplicative property. That is to say, you have to multiply the likelihood of getting a particular outcome as 1 and 2 times 1 and 2 times 1 and 2, and so on. Okay? And you have to do that for 63 sets of operations. And so to pick 63 coin flips correctly, if you're, again, using fair coins, and that's the only information that you have, then the odds are 2 to the power of 63, or 1 in 9.2 quintillion. So now there are all kinds of subtleties and changes that we can make to the final calculations based on certain kinds of information. But because of the number of games and because the probabilities are multiplicative, then as you repeat the operations, statistically speaking, it's almost impossible to get the correct final predictions. All right. But there's some good news. It's not entirely random because you can know a lot about some of the teams or all of the teams that are playing. There are some games where you can be almost certain which team's going to win. Okay. And so the odds shift in your favor with better knowledge. And that's why the casinos, by the way, don't want you counting cards at the blackjack table. They don't want you to have additional knowledge about the probabilities of likely outcomes. And so, realistically, you could argue that there are some games that are almost guaranteed to be wins for certain teams. And historically, we would have said, oh yeah, all the number one seeds, and the number one seeds, at least in the first round, play against the number 16 seeds. Well, that's a guaranteed win. And that was actually the case up until 2018, when my beloved University of Virginia Cavaliers decided to become the first number one seed ever to lose to a number 16. So they broke the streak. They lost to University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Haven't heard from them since. That is the Baltimore County team. Interestingly, Virginia went on the following year to win the national championship. So talk about uh, two ends of the continuum, bookends. Anyway, but then in 2023, it happened again. So that is Purdue lost to number 16, Fairleigh Dickinson. And so as we go back in the tournament and look at the history, we now know that the top seeds are 154 wins against 2 losses to the number 16s. So that means that the latter have won 1.28% of the time. But again, thank goodness, we know that in general, the ones are going to win. And so if you pick those 4 games correctly, then you only have to pick the remaining 59 games. Uh, but that said, even if you consider the remaining 59 as 50-50 propositions, your odds would still be incalculable. The figure's too long to read. So here's another way to think about just the first round, and it might give you a little bit more hope. So if I were advising you to bet on this year's tournament, first thing I do is say, okay, we'll pick all number 1 seeds. Pick the 4 number 1s. The odds are 99% roughly that they should win. It used to be 100, but things have changed. After that, the number 2 seeds have won 93% of the time. So again, certainly not 100, but a very high proportion of the time. The number 3 seeds have won 85%. The number 4s, 79%. The number 5 seeds have beat the number 12 65% of the time. And the number 6 seeds have won 62%. So they're all favored, but obviously the odds are less and less likely, or less and less certain, that those teams are going to beat the other teams. They're matched more closely. They're ranked more similarly. Okay? And then after you do all of that, you've got the 7s versus the 10s and the 8th seeds versus the 9 seeds, and you can almost consider those a coin flip, basically. Okay? So if you convert all of those odds that I just mentioned into proportions and base these on the probability function, we can then calculate the odds with that knowledge of picking all 32 teams that are supposed to win, or picking 32 out of 32 teams accurately, having a 100% record. And the odds there, with that information that I've just shared with you, and that's without digging even further into additional factors that might affect each team. You've got roughly a 1 in 15 million chance of picking the first, uh, sorry, a 15 in a million chance, a 15 times out of a million, 15 times in a million chance of picking all 32 teams correctly. So it's definitely possible. Okay. But that's the easiest part because after that, you still have to predict correctly the remaining 31 games, right? So in addition to having picked the first 32, which can be done, like I said, statistically speaking, roughly 15 times in a million, but then you've got to pick the next 31 as well. And then it gets increasingly difficult. Uh, and I'll explain why. So let's argue that the higher seeds should win, hypothetically, a disproportionate amount of the time, right? And that would be true in the second round too, obviously, when you're at the round of 16, which has 16 games leading into the final 16. And there, though, the odds are slightly lower in terms of your guarantees. So let's say, for example, the distribution is something like the 4 number 1 seed next time out winning 70% of the time, the higher seeds winning 60% of the time, and then a bunch of coin flips and so on. And so on that basis, after round 1, the odds of picking a perfect round 2 are somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.2 in 10,000. But here's the problem. You're not starting at round 2 because you have to multiply those odds from round 2 of obtaining a perfect bracket with your odds from the first round. So, in other words, what are your odds of picking at the outset perfect brackets from the first round and the second round leading into the so-called Sweet 16? So that's 48 games in total. Well, again, if you do the math, statistically speaking, your odds are about 1 in 2 billion. But that's with pretty good knowledge and based on all of your statistical guesses panning out. Perhaps most dauntingly, your odds are better, if you will, of winning the Lotto 649. Those are about 1 in 14 million if you want to play. Okay? So that's over 100 times better than picking a bracket just through the Sweet 16. And that's being generous. Why? Because many times the higher seeds don't win for, again, various reasons. And so, has anyone ever had a perfect record the first weekend of the tournament when they play those 32 games? That is a perfect bracket leading up to their Sweet 16? Yes, it's happened once that we can confirm. Greg Nigel accomplished the feat back in 2019 before then busting in the next round. So the reason it's so tough is because you have to judiciously select precisely the right, not only the winners, obviously, but the right upsets that you expect along the way. And by definition, that's difficult to do. You have to factor in the schedules, the strengths and the weaknesses of each of the teams, the coaching, the injuries, their motivations, foul trouble, and so on. And then you have to pick the right favorites and exactly which teams will, in fact, pull off the upsets. And on top of all of that, you have to get all of the coin flip games correct as well. All right? How difficult is that? Well, I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to share with you the example of the best I've ever done with my NCAA brackets. And it actually goes back 10 years to 2015. That was my best year ever. So, what happened? Well, I'm just going to share with you what happened on the very first day of the first round. So, the first round takes 2 days. You play 32 games over the 2 days, 16 games on each day. So, I'm just going to tell you what happened on day one with the first 16 games that I had to pick. Okay. So, this goes back to the 2015 tournament, and this was March 19th of 2015. So, what happened? Well, I picked Kentucky and Villanova. They were the two number one seeds that were playing that day. Done. They both won big, no problem. I also picked Arizona as the lone number two seed that was playing that day. No problem. Now I'm 3 for 3. Only 13 games to go. So for the moment, I want to skip the number three seeds that played on the first day. Some of the 4 through 7 seeds played and won comfortably, if not in blowouts, and these included Butler, Xavier, Utah, and Georgetown. Great. And I picked all of those teams. So just based on what I've said so far, I'm 7 for 7. Genius. No, just playing the odds, obviously. But what happened with the other 9 games? So I gave you the good news up front. 7 for 7. What about the other 9 games on day one of the NCAA tournament? Well, all 9 of the other games essentially came down to the final minute or even the final possession. There were 5 1-point games, 1 2-point game, 2 3-point games, and a 4-point game, which actually was a 2-point game, which I'll explain in a moment. Okay, so consider first the number threes. 3 number 3s played that day. And what happened? They were all absurdly close games, including 2 upsets, at least by rankings. So number 14, UAB beat number 3, Iowa State, 60-59. As Morris tipped in a missed shot with just a couple of ticks left on the clock. And if that wasn't crazy enough, number 14, Georgia State's Hunter, hit a 27-footer with about 3 seconds left to lift their squad over Baylor 57-56. And his father, Hunter's father, was literally the coach. He fell off his chair onto the floor with excitement, as you could appreciate. Right? Well, so I'm no longer a genius because I lost both of those coin flip games. Even worse, I had Baylor advancing to the Sweet 16, so I lost on that point as well. However, the good news, I did pick Notre Dame, number 3, over Northeastern, and they won by a whopping 4 points. Actually, Northeastern was only down by 2 points, and they had the ball with less than 10 seconds to play. But unfortunately, they turned the ball over, and with about 4 seconds left, they had to foul. Notre Dame made the free throws, and that's your final score. In my case, then, I only ended up 1 for 3 in those 3 games. But then there were 6 more one possession games that I needed to pick correctly. Spoiler alert, I got 4 out of the 6 remaining games correct, and that meant that I ended up with 12 correct picks out of 16 on the first day. And that's the best I've ever done. The other games, number 10, Ohio State knocked off number 7, VCU. I picked that one. 75-72, but only in overtime and after VCU missed a 3-point shot with a chance to tie with 11 seconds left in overtime. Number 12, Wolford, who I picked in an upset, dropped their game to Arkansas 56-53, but only after missing 3 times from beyond the arc their final possession, including it as time expired. So again, could have turned out differently. I contemplated picking Harvard over North Carolina, especially since my former high schooler buddy, Tommy Amaker, happens to be the head coach at Harvard. And he's a pretty smart guy, especially on basketball. But in the end, I went with my gut, and I did pick the eventual winner, UNC, who edged Harvard 67-65, but only after blowing a 16-point lead and after Harvard missed 3 3-point attempts in about the final half minute of the game. So again, that could have turned out differently. And finally, what about the remaining 3 1-point games? I picked NC State to beat LSU, which they did 66-65. How'd they do it? Well, they actually won on a last second shot that rolled around the rim and then fell through as time expired. They were also a bit lucky in that LSU didn't score in the final 4 minutes of that game, which included 3 missed field goals, 1 turnover, and missing their final 6 free throws. Who would have bet on that? I also insightfully picked Cincinnati, number 8, over Purdue, who were number 9. They won 66-65 as well, but they won in overtime and only after overcoming a 7-point deficit in the final 48 seconds of the game, including a layup as time expired. And finally, I messed up by picking SMU over UCLA. The Bruins won 60-59, again by a point, in large measure because of a really terrible 3-point shot by UCLA's best shooter with 13 seconds left. But they got bailed out because the SMU player was guilty of goaltending. So the shot would have actually missed badly, excuse me, but the SMU player touched the ball before it actually hit the rim. And so, again, UCLA won. Didn't see that coming. So in closing, as mentioned, I got 12 out of 16 picks correct, and that remains my single best day of the tournament. I then got 10 out of 16 right on the next day, giving me a grand total of 22 correct out of 32 games. And so obviously that's not even close to a perfect bracket. And that's only the first round. And that's the best I've ever done. And so how many one possession games will there be each weekend? How many one pointers? How many teams will win on that last second shot or even on a half court heave or whatever, something along those lines? Remember, what I just described to you in 2015, there were out of the 16, there were 5 1-point games just the first weekend where you're supposed to have your highest rate of success, predictive success, right? And in fact, many people get more than half the games correct, and you could just pick the favorites and do better than 50-50, quite frankly. In fact, most of the time you can get somewhere close to 75% correct, especially if you just rigorously follow the rankings as such. Now, again, there can be a variety of factors, and upsets can and do happen, and so on. But the point is you're probably not realistic to expect to do much better than that. The smartest and most knowledgeable people in the basketball universe get things wrong, and often more so even than yours truly. And I'm no expert in these areas. So, and if you study the simulations, how brackets are picked, how the statistical odds are calculated, and if you were to get as much knowledge as possible on every team, and be as systematic and rigorous and as scientific and as statistically accurate as you could be, your odds of picking the best or perfect bracket are still one in tens of billions. So I never thought I'd say this, but you might as well go out and buy a lottery ticket or a Powerball. Your odds are actually much better of winning one of those games, and presumably you get a lot more money than trying to pick the right bracket in the NCAA tournament. Maybe stick with just trying to pick the Final Four. If you do that, you're doing pretty well. All right, that's it for today. And in the meantime, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. And hopefully, we'll see you tomorrow. What are the odds? I guess we'll find out.